June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. German officers intercept American radio chatter and can't believe what they're hearing. Every single American battalion coordinating in real time with handheld radios, while Wehrmacht commanders are still waiting for motorcycle couriers to deliver orders through artillery fire. The Germans had mocked these American walkie-talkies as expensive toys, too fragile and unnecessary for real warfare, until 50,000 of them flooded the European theater and turned battlefield coordination into an American superpower. So how did a 35-pound backpack radio that the Nazis laughed at become the single piece of technology that ended their communication superiority forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In September of 1939, German panzer tanks rolled across the Polish border and changed warfare forever. The world watched in shock as the Wehrmacht conquered an entire country in just 27 days. Newspapers called it Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, and military experts scrambled to understand how Germany moved so fast and hit so hard. The secret wasn't just better tanks or braver soldiers. The secret was coordination. While the Polish cavalry charged with sabers, German tank commanders talked to each other through radio headsets, calling in airstrikes and surrounding enemy positions before the Poles even knew they were flanked. By 1940, this same radio-coordinated machine had steamrolled through France in 6 weeks, a country that had held off Germany for 4 years in the previous war. The German military seemed unbeatable, and their communication system seemed perfect. But the truth was more complicated. Yes, German tank commanders had radios in their vehicles. Yes, the Luftwaffe could coordinate with ground forces. But when you zoomed into the actual infantrymen fighting in ditches and forests, the picture looked very different. German battalion commanders relied on something that hadn't changed since World War I: telephone wire. Signalmen would run forward with heavy spools of cable, unrolling it behind them as the troops advanced, connecting field telephones so officers could talk to headquarters. When the wire got cut by artillery, which happened constantly, soldiers had to run back and find the break, splicing it together under fire. If wire communication failed completely, they sent motorcycle couriers racing across battlefields with written orders, hoping they wouldn't get shot or lost. This system worked during rapid advances when everything went according to plan. But in messy, chaotic battles, communication broke down fast. German military doctrine actually distrusted portable radios for infantry use. Officers worried that radios were too heavy, the batteries died too quickly, and enemy forces could listen in on every transmission. The Wehrmacht had developed some portable radio sets, like the Torn Fu B1, but these weighed over 40 pounds, had a range of barely 2 miles on a good day, and were issued only to company commanders, not regular troops. Most German soldiers never even saw one. The prevailing attitude among Wehrmacht signal officers was that radios were unreliable luxuries. Real armies used proven technology: telephone wire, motorcycle couriers, and occasionally carrier pigeons. When intelligence reports reached Berlin about American experiments with portable infantry radios, German officers literally laughed. One report from 1941 dismissed American radio development as typical wasteful extravagance from a nation that has never fought a modern war. This confidence made sense at the time. By late 1941, Germany controlled most of Europe. Their battle-tested communication system had worked from Poland to France to the gates of Moscow. Meanwhile, America hadn't fought a major war since 1918, and their military was tiny and outdated. When American troops first landed in North Africa in November 1942, German veterans expected to crush these inexperienced soldiers easily. The early battles seemed to confirm German assumptions. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces handed American troops a humiliating defeat, capturing hundreds of prisoners and destroying dozens of tanks. Among the captured equipment,
German signal officers found American SCR-194 and SCR-195 radio sets. They examined these bulky devices with amusement. The radios required separate backpack batteries, had complicated tuning mechanisms, and seemed fragile. Expensive American toys, one captured German report called them. Proof that the Americans tried to buy victory with gadgets instead of earning it with discipline and training.
But something strange started happening in late 1943. German intelligence officers in Italy began intercepting American radio transmissions that didn't make sense. The communications were too clear, too frequent, and coming from too many different locations. American units seemed to be coordinating movements at the battalion level in real time, adjusting to German counterattacks within minutes instead of hours. Wehrmacht commanders assumed the Americans had simply strung more telephone wire, but reconnaissance patrols reported something different. They saw American soldiers carrying radio equipment on their backs, talking into handsets while walking through the mountains. The radios looked smaller than the clunky SCR-194s from North Africa. They seemed to work without constant adjustment, and there were so many of them. In December 1943, a German patrol in Italy captured an American radio man and his equipment. The soldier was carrying a green metal box on a packboard frame, about the size of a small suitcase. Inside were 18 radio tubes, a battery pack, and a handset connected by a coiled cord. The whole thing weighed 35 pounds, less than a full combat pack. The American soldier, terrified and shivering in the cold, demonstrated how it worked. He flipped a switch, turned a dial, pressed the talk button on the handset, and spoke. His voice came out clear, no static, no crackling. The range, he said through an interpreter, was 3 miles in open terrain, sometimes 5 miles under perfect conditions. The German officers stared at this device with growing unease. They asked how many radios like this the Americans had. The prisoner shrugged. "Every battalion has them," he said. "Some companies, too. They keep making more." The report from this capture reached Wehrmacht headquarters in January 1944, 5 months before D-Day. The Americans called this device the SCR-300. German signal experts read the specifications with disbelief. Frequency modulation instead of amplitude modulation, which meant less interference. Simple channel selection, so even untrained soldiers could use it. Portable enough that one man could carry it while fighting. Reliable enough to work in rain, mud, and extreme cold. And the Americans were mass-producing these radios by the thousands. One German general wrote in his diary that night, "If this report is accurate, we have badly underestimated American industrial capacity and tactical innovation. A radio in every battalion changes everything." But by then, it was already too late. The first SCR-300s were already being loaded onto ships bound for England, preparing for an invasion where American coordination would prove unstoppable. On June 6, 1944, at exactly 6:30 in the morning, the first wave of American soldiers hit Omaha Beach carrying 70 pounds of equipment through chest-deep water while German machine guns tore into them from concrete bunkers above. In that chaos of explosions and screamings and bodies floating in the surf, radio operators struggled to keep their SCR-300s dry, holding the green metal boxes above their heads as they stumbled toward the beach. Many radios got soaked and stopped working. Many radio operators died in the first 10 minutes. But enough of them made it through, and by mid-morning, something remarkable was happening. American officers on the beach were talking directly to naval destroyers offshore, calling in fire missions against specific bunkers. Battalion commanders were coordinating with units landing to their left and right, finding gaps in German defenses and pushing troops through. Within hours, the Americans had established a communications network across 5 miles of beach without laying a single foot of telephone wire. Directing mortar teams, calling for medical evacuation, requesting ammunition resupply. One German report from that afternoon described the American radio network as impossible to disrupt because there was no central switchboard to destroy, no wire to cut,
No couriers to shoot. Every American unit could talk to every other unit within range. When German artillery knocked out one radio operator, another one simply took over on a different frequency. The communication network healed itself faster than the Germans could damage it. By late June, American forces were pushing inland through the Norman hedgerows, those ancient walls of earth and roots that divided every field into a natural fortress. This terrain was a nightmare for attackers. German soldiers could hide behind any hedgerow, pop up, fire a few shots, then disappear. Tanks couldn't see more than 50 yards ahead. Infantry companies got separated from their battalions within minutes. In previous wars, this kind of terrain would have broken down all communication and turned battles into confused, isolated fights. But American troops had SCR-300s, and that changed everything. A sergeant pinned down behind a hedgerow could radio his position to the company commander 300 yards away.
The company commander could call the battalion commander a mile back. The battalion commander could direct a tank platoon to flank around through a gap spotted by another company. All of this happened in minutes, not hours. All of this happened through voice communication, officers and sergeants talking to each other like they were standing face to face. German forces had nothing like this capability. A Wehrmacht battalion commander in Normandy still depended on telephone wire that broke every time artillery landed nearby. His signalmen spent half their time running through hedgerows trying to find breaks in the line and splice them back together, often getting killed in the process. When wire communication failed completely, runners had to sprint from hedgerow to hedgerow, carrying written messages, hoping they remembered the orders correctly and didn't get shot. By the time orders reached frontline troops, the tactical situation had often changed completely. German officers began writing bitter reports about American radio superiority and how it gave the enemy an unfair advantage. One captured German diary from July 1944 included this entry. The Americans talk to each other constantly. They coordinate like a swarm of bees. We are deaf and blind by comparison.
The industrial scale of American radio production stunned German intelligence analysts. By August 1944, reports indicated that the Americans had landed over 50,000 SCR-300 radios in France. 50,000. The entire German military had perhaps 5,000 portable radios of any type, most of them inferior to the SCR-300 in every way. American factories were stamping out these radios faster than German factories could build rifles. Motorola, Galvin Manufacturing, and a dozen other American companies had converted their peacetime assembly lines to military production, and they were churning out SCR-300s by the thousands every month. Each radio cost about $200 to manufacture, which seemed expensive until you realized that a single well-coordinated artillery strike called in by radio could destroy $1,000 worth of enemy equipment in seconds. The radios paid for themselves in saved lives and won battles. In December 1944, Germany launched its last great offensive in the West, smashing through American lines in the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack came in the middle of winter through fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft and reduced visibility to almost nothing. German commanders thought this weather would finally neutralize American advantages.
They cut telephone wires and overran American positions so quickly that traditional communication networks collapsed. For a few days, it looked like the German gamble might work. But the Americans had their SCR-300s, and those radios kept working through the snow and fog and chaos. Surrounded American units called in their positions so relief forces could find them. Artillery observers talked directly to gun batteries miles away, dropping shells on German columns that couldn't see more than 50 feet ahead. Battalion commanders coordinated defensive positions while retreating, maintaining unit cohesion even during desperate fighting. The radios didn't stop the German advance, but they kept the American defense organized enough to hold critical road junctions until reinforcements arrived. By January 1945, captured German signal officers were being interrogated about why their communication systems had failed so badly. One officer, a major, who had fought since Poland in 1939, sat in an American tent and examined an SCR-300 laid out on a table before him. He picked up the handset, felt its weight, and studied the simple controls.
Through an interpreter, he said something that the American interrogator wrote down word for word.
"We were told your equipment was inferior. We were told you were amateurs who relied on machines instead of training. But this radio is better than anything we have. And you have so many of them. You give them to sergeants, to privates even. We could not give them to colonels. That is the difference between your army and ours. You trust your soldiers with power. We hoard it at the top." The American interrogator asked if the radios had made a difference in the war. The German major looked at him like the question was stupid. "Lieutenant," he said, "your radios won you the war. You just do not know it yet." In March of 1945, a German Signal Corps officer named Franz Weber sat in a prisoner of war camp in eastern France, watching American soldiers go about their daily routines with a mixture of fascination and despair. Weber was 34 years old, a communications specialist who had served in the Wehrmacht since 1938, and he had spent the last 7 years of his life believing that German technology and German discipline were superior to anything the Americans could produce. He had believed this so completely that he had never questioned it, not even when the evidence started piling up against him. But now, sitting on a wooden bench in the cold March sunlight, with nothing to do but watch and think, the lies he had been told were crumbling inside his mind, like a bombed-out building finally collapsing. The Americans had assigned Weber to work in the camp motor pool, helping maintain trucks and jeeps, which meant he spent his days around American soldiers and their equipment. One morning, he watched a young private, maybe 19 years old, load an SCR-300 radio into the back of a jeep with the same casual attitude someone might use when loading a bag of groceries. The private tossed the radio onto the seat, not roughly, but without any special care, then climbed in and drove away. Weber stood there, holding a wrench, staring after the jeep, feeling something shift in his understanding. Back in Germany, a radio of any type was precious equipment, carefully tracked and guarded, issued only to senior officers who had proven themselves trustworthy. This American private had just thrown a radio into a jeep like it was nothing, like there were plenty more where that came from. Because there were. That was the point. The Americans had so many radios they could treat them as disposable. Later that week, an American sergeant noticed Weber's interest in the radios and, either out of kindness or boredom, offered to show him how the SCR-300 actually worked. They sat together in the motor pool garage while the sergeant demonstrated the system. He opened the metal case and pointed out the components: 18 tubes arranged in neat rows, a battery pack that could run for 12 hours, a handset with a simple push-to-talk button. The tuning system had only 40 preset channels, which meant even the dumbest soldier could operate it without extensive training. You flipped the switch, selected a channel, pressed the button, and talked. That was it. No complicated calibration, no constant adjustment, no engineering degree required. The sergeant explained that frequency modulation, FM instead of AM, made the signal much clearer and harder to jam. He said the effective range was about 3 miles in good conditions, sometimes more if you were on a hill. He mentioned, almost casually, that American factories had built more than 50,000 of these radios during the war. Weber translated that number in his head. 50,000. 50,000 SCR-300s, not counting all the other radio types the Americans used. He thought about the German Tornfu B-1, the closest thing the Wehrmacht had to a portable infantry radio. It weighed 42 pounds compared to the SCR-300's 35. It had a range of maybe 2 miles on a perfect day with a tall antenna. It required constant tuning and adjustment. And Germany had built perhaps 5,000 of them, maybe less, for an entire military that stretched from France to Russia. The numbers made him feel sick. This wasn't a small advantage the Americans had. This was a crushing, overwhelming superiority that no amount of German courage or tactical skill could overcome. You could have the best trained soldiers in the world, but if they couldn't talk to each other while the enemy could, you would lose. It was that simple. But the number of radios wasn't even the most shocking part. What really broke something inside Weber's mind was realizing that the Americans trusted ordinary soldiers with this equipment. That sergeant showing him the radio was not an officer. He was an enlisted man, probably from some farm in Iowa or factory in Pennsylvania, and the U.S. Army had handed him a sophisticated piece of communications technology and said, "Here, coordinate artillery strikes with this." In the Wehrmacht, communication equipment was strictly controlled from the top down. Officers gave orders, enlisted men obeyed. The idea of giving a sergeant the power to call in airstrikes or redirect an entire company was unthinkable. It went against everything German military doctrine taught about hierarchy and control. But the Americans didn't care about traditional hierarchy. They cared about what worked. And what worked was putting power in the hands of the people actually doing the fighting, letting them make decisions in real time without waiting for approval from some colonel 10 miles behind the lines. Weber started writing in a small notebook he had been given by the camp authorities, trying to work through what he was learning. He wrote in German, filling page after page with thoughts he couldn't share with anyone else. "We were taught that American soldiers were soft," he wrote one evening. "We were told they relied on equipment because they lacked discipline and fighting spirit. But now I understand the truth. They relied on equipment because their equipment was better than ours, and their system of using it was better than ours. We mocked them for giving radios to common soldiers. We said this proved they had no proper respect for military order. But they were right and we were wrong. A sergeant with a radio can do more than a colonel with a motorcycle courier. This is not a weakness, this is a strength we could not match." The more Weber observed, the more he saw this pattern everywhere in American military organization. The food in the POW camp came from massive mobile kitchens that could feed thousands of men hot meals every day. The trucks bringing supplies never seemed to stop coming. The Americans had so much of everything that they could afford to be generous even to prisoners. One day in April, a truck arrived carrying Coca-Cola in glass bottles, enough for every prisoner to have one.
Weber held the cold bottle in his hands, condensation dripping down the glass, and laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it. Germany was starving. Berlin was burning. His family, if they were still alive, was probably eating potato peels and grass. And here he was, a prisoner of war, drinking a cold Coca-Cola provided free by his captors who had so much abundance they could waste it on men they had defeated. The bottle in his hand represented everything wrong with the propaganda he had believed. America was not weak. America was not decadent. America was so strong it could conquer you and then give you soda pop just to show you how little the cost mattered. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The news reached the POW camp that afternoon, and Weber sat on his bunk while other prisoners wept or shouted or sat in stunned silence. He felt nothing except a kind of hollow acceptance. Of course Germany had lost. How could it have ended any other way? You could not fight a country that outproduced you 10-1 and out-innovated you in every field. You could not win a war when your enemy's privates had better equipment than your colonels. You could not overcome an opponent who had solved problems you didn't even know existed.
The SCR-300 radio was just one example, but it symbolized everything. It represented American industrial capacity, their ability to mass-produce sophisticated technology. It represented their trust in ordinary soldiers, their willingness to push decision-making down to the lowest levels. It represented their practical, results-oriented thinking, caring more about what worked than about maintaining traditional hierarchies and old ways of doing things. In late May, an American officer came to interview prisoners who had technical knowledge, trying to understand German military systems for post-war analysis. When he reached Weber, they sat across from each other at a wooden table in a small office. The American officer, a captain with glasses and a clipboard, asked standard questions about German communications equipment and procedures. Weber answered honestly,
describing the torn.fub1 and the telephone wire systems and the motorcycle couriers. Then the captain asked a more open question. In your professional opinion, what was Germany's biggest weakness in military communications? Weber thought for a long moment before answering. Through the interpreter, he said, "We did not have a weakness. We had a philosophy that was wrong. We believed communication should flow from top to bottom, from generals to soldiers."
You believed communication should flow in all directions, between everyone who needed to coordinate. We thought controlling information was power. You understood that sharing information was power. Your SCR-300 radio is not just a better machine than our equipment. It is the physical form of a better idea about how to fight a war. The American captain wrote this down carefully, then looked up with interest. "Is the SCR-300 that important?" he asked. Weber smiled, a sad, tired smile that held 7 years of watching his country destroy itself. "Captain," he said, "your radio did not win the war alone. Your tanks and planes and factories all mattered. But the radio represents how you think. You saw a problem, communication in fluid battles, and you solved it with technology that anyone could use. We saw the same problem and tried to solve it with stricter discipline and better training. When problems got worse, we demanded more discipline, more obedience, more control from the top. You demanded better tools for the people doing the actual fighting. That is why you won. Not because your soldiers were braver than ours, because your system trusted them with power, and ours did not."
The interview ended shortly after that, and Weber walked back across the camp yard toward his barracks. He looked up at the clear May sky and thought about what would come next. Eventually, he would go home to Germany, or what was left of it. He would try to find his family in the ruins. He would spend the rest of his life in a defeated country that would have to rebuild everything from nothing. But he would carry with him this knowledge, this painful understanding of why Germany had lost. It wasn't because Germans were inferior or because the Allies got lucky. It was because Germany had built its entire system on false ideas about power and control and hierarchy. And those false ideas had run straight into American pragmatism and abundance and trust. The SCR-300 radio had been just one small piece of that larger truth, but it was the piece that Weber could see and touch and understand. 35 pounds of metal and tubes and wire that represented a revolution in how wars were fought. A revolution Germany had mocked until it was far too late to matter.
They had not seen each other in 2 years. She had aged a decade in that time, her face thin and lined with worry, her hands rough from work. But she was alive, and their daughter was alive, and that was more than many families could say. Inside the apartment, Weber saw the reality of German defeat in every detail. The furniture had been burned for heat during the previous winter. The wallpaper was water-stained from rain coming through the damaged roof. Maria and their daughter Greta, now 11 years old, slept in one room with blankets hung over the windows to keep out the cold. They ate turnips and black bread, the same meal every day, because that was all the ration cards allowed. Maria worked 10 hours a day clearing rubble from bombed buildings for 30 cents and a bowl of soup. This was life in defeated Germany, and it would not get better anytime soon. The contrast with the American POW camp, where he had drunk Coca-Cola and eaten hot meals from industrial kitchens, made Weber feel almost guilty for having been captured.
One evening in December, he sat at the kitchen table with Greta, doing her homework by candlelight, because the electricity only worked a few hours each day. She was studying mathematics, struggling with a problem about calculating distances. Weber helped her work through it, and as he did, he remembered the American sergeant showing him how the SCR-300 radio worked, how simple they had made the controls so any soldier could use it without complicated training. He thought about the 18 tubes inside that green metal case, The engineering that had gone into making something sophisticated work reliably in mud and rain and cold. He wondered what German engineers could have built if the Nazi government had trusted scientists and inventors instead of trying to control everything through ideology and fear. Weber had brought back one physical item from his time as a prisoner, hidden in his canvas bag beneath his extra shirt and worn-out boots. It was a broken SCR-300 handset, just the microphone and speaker unit with a few inches of coiled cord still attached. An American guard had given it to him as a souvenir when the POW camp closed, a small gesture of respect between soldiers. Weber kept it wrapped in cloth, and sometimes he would take it out and hold it, feeling the weight of the black plastic in his hands, thinking about what it represented. This small piece of technology had been part of the communication network that coordinated the defeat of his country. But it also represented a way of thinking that Germany needed to learn if it ever wanted to rebuild.
They won because every soldier could call for help, could coordinate with units nearby, and could adapt to situations in real time. We lost because only generals could give orders, and information flowed in one direction, from top to bottom. The radio did not just send voices through the air, it sent power downward through the ranks. That was the revolution we never saw coming. The British officer wrote this down carefully, then asked if Weber thought Germany could have won if they had developed similar technology. Weber shook his head slowly. The technology was not the real problem, he said. The problem was the thinking behind it. American military doctrine trusted ordinary soldiers with important equipment and important decisions. German doctrine centralized all power and control. We could have built a radio like the SCR-300. We had engineers smart enough, but we would not have used it the same way. We would have kept it at headquarters, guarded it, restricted who could operate it. The Americans handed it to teenagers and said, "Here, coordinate our artillery with this." That difference in trust, that difference in how we thought about power and control, that is what defeated us. Not the radio itself, but what the radio represented about two different ways of organizing an army.
Years later, when West Germany formed the Bundeswehr as its new military in 1955, the organization studied American and British military doctrine carefully. They adopted American-style portable radios for infantry units. They trained soldiers at every level to take initiative and make decisions without waiting for orders from above. They built a new military philosophy based on flexibility and trust rather than rigid hierarchy. Franz Weber, working as an instructor helping train the new Signal Corps, saw this transformation and felt a complicated mixture of sadness and hope. His generation had learned these lessons too late, had paid for their ignorance with a catastrophic defeat and millions of dead. But perhaps the next generation would do better, would understand that modern warfare required modern thinking, would trust their soldiers with the tools and authority to do their jobs effectively.
On his desk at home, Weber kept that broken SCR-300 handset, the one the American Guard had given him in 1945. It sat next to a photograph of his family, a daily reminder of what he had learned in captivity. The radio that Germans had scoffed at had helped coordinate the defeat of the Wehrmacht battalion by battalion, city by city, until nothing remained but ruins and lessons learned too late. But those lessons were real and valuable. Superior technology was not about complexity or expense. It was about practical application at scale, about building tools that worked reliably and giving them to the people who actually needed them. Victory came not from hoarding control at the top, but from trusting power downward, from believing that ordinary people, given the right tools and right training, could accomplish extraordinary things. The Americans had understood this instinctively. Germany had to learn it through defeat. That small piece of broken plastic on Weber's desk embodied that painful education, a reminder that wars were won by those who adapted fastest, trusted deepest, and produced most abundantly.